Few Good Men was a blockbuster movie back in 1992. Had two mega actors, Jack Nicholson, who played the role of a Marine who was charged with the death of another Marine, and then Tom Cruise, who was a lawyer who was questioning Nicholson. And I guess the most famous scene and lines took place in the courtroom. Cruise is presenting the question. Nicholson is on the stand, and Nicholson says, "So you want answers?" And Cruise said, "I think I'm entitled to answers." And then Nicholson shot back, "You want answers?" And Cruise said, "I want the truth." And then Nicholson uttered that famous line, "You can't handle the truth." Well, sometimes the truth is hard to handle because sometimes the truth makes us uncomfortable. It makes us have to stop and really look at ourselves. Tonight we're going to look at one of the most famous parables of Jesus, and that is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it all began with a religious expert, or some translations say lawyer, a religious lawyer expert asking Jesus a question. So let's set the stage and jump into it. Luke chapter 10, verse number 25. One day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" And the man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Now notice it points out that he was an expert in religious law. He was probably the greatest enemy of Jesus. It was the experts in religious law that always criticized Jesus. And he was testing Jesus, which means he wanted to expose Jesus as a false teacher, as a heretic. And so he asked Jesus this question: "What does the law say?" Or "How do I inherit eternal life?" He said, "Well, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." Then in verse 28, Jesus basically said, "That's a great answer. Now you should go out and do it. You should go out and live it out in your life." Now, I don't think Jesus was suggesting that we can earn eternal life. That's not what he was doing. He was simply holding up a mirror, if you will, so the religious expert could see the sin in his own heart. And when I read this text, it's almost like a game show. I mean, he asked Jesus a question, Jesus asked him a question back, and now he asked a bonus question in verse number 29. The man wanted to justify his action, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" So this questioning is going back and forth. And now, who is my neighbor? To me, this really reveals his motive. And his motive was self-justification, because he had a very narrow view of who his neighbor was, or who he thought his neighbor should be. It wasn't people that were different than him. It was people that were like him. It wasn't people that thought differently or lived differently or people from a different culture. That's not how he viewed his neighbor. In other words, he thought he could love God. This is important. He thought he could love God by being selective in how he treated other people. That's not the way it works, is it? So Jesus proceeded to tell this story, this parable. Pick it up in verse number 30. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Now, I'm going to let you know right now, I'm going to have to finish this parable next week, this teaching. So let me just kind of work through some stuff here, and we'll kind of set the stage for next week. Let's look at the main characters in this particular parable. First of all, we have the victim, and Jesus specifically said he was a Jewish man. He didn't just call him a man, he called him a Jewish man. He was a Jewish man traveling down that notorious road between Jerusalem down to Jericho. We were there in February. We saw how rugged this Judean desert was. These two cities were about 18 miles apart, and so to move from Jerusalem to Jericho or back would take probably more than a day, day and a half, maybe even a 2-day journey. So first we have the Jewish man, then we have the robbers. All right, because the road was steep and treacherous and out in the wilderness, it was an ideal place for thieves to hide. And they would rob people, okay, because it was really the only way to get between the two cities. So these thieves would lay in rocks or hide in rocks and come out and rob people. So this is just another reminder that, they had thieves and robbers and thugs back in those days as well, okay? People have always been around that have bad intentions. And then we see the priest. The priest was a Levite who obviously knew the law of God. He knew the Old Testament. He knew the law that God gave to Moses. And I'll get deeper into this next week. I'm not gonna get too deep right now. And then the Samaritan. Notice Jesus calls him a Samaritan, okay? Despised Samaritan is how Jesus described him, a despised Samaritan. So it's important for us when we look at this parable tonight and next week to understand the social hierarchy of the day. Jesus is speaking to a Jewish man, the lawyer or the religious expert. Okay, he's speaking to that man who looked down on the Samaritans. In his mind, in a Jewish man's mind, the Samaritans were below him. They were scum, all right? And this was ingrained in him and in their culture. So he was thinking to himself, wait a minute, you're talking about a Jewish man and you're talking about a despised Samaritan. Do you mean God expects me to care about people who are different than me? People who don't look like me? People who don't think like me? People who maybe don't behave like me? Yes, that's what Jesus was saying. Now again, we'll break this parable down next week, so make sure that you join me next week, and better than that, make sure you invite someone to join me next week. But it's important for us to realize we can't be selective. That's the truth. We can't be selective in how we treat people or who we really show the love of God to. So again, we'll pick it up more next week. I hope to see you in one of our services. Man, we are having a time here on Sundays, 9:15 and 11:15. Join us right here, would you?